Okay, we're recording. All right, thanks everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Unit 13 on the Palestine syllabus. My name is John Harfouche. I'm at the University of Alabama, Huntsville, and I was one of the people involved in creating this syllabus. The point of the syllabus, broadly speaking, is just to provide students with some guide to the literature on Palestine, the question of Palestine, the Zionist occupation of Palestine, and resistance to the occupation from an Arab point of view, a Palestinian point of view. And of course, we have readings, we have a summary of the readings, we have study questions for you on the syllabus, and then we've made these lectures, including some of the authors from the pieces that we featured on the syllabus. And the readings for this unit come from Fanon and Ali Shariati. We read the Fanon's 1960 speech that summarizes some of his most important and most famous views on anti-colonial violence. We then read his letter to the Iranian philosopher Ali Shariati. Shariati both translated and interpreted Fanon's work, but he was also just an incredibly influential philosopher in his own right. And then finally, we read Shariati's discussion of Shahid, where he details a certain political or even anti-colonial relationship to death. And those readings are accompanied by several important essays by our guests today. And I'll just go around the screen. To my left, we have Bashir Saade from Stirling University in Scotland. We'll be discussing his 2014? Is this a 2014 article? I can't remember.
If it's actually the date anymore,
I don't know why I said the date when I don't even know it. I could have just left that out. Anyway, your essay, Martyrology and Conceptions of Time in Hezbollah's Writing Practices. Just below Bashir here is Fouzi Slisli. Fouzi is an independent scholar, and we're going to be talking about his 2008 article, Islam, the Elephant in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. And then last but not least, just below me is Arash Davari, and we'll be discussing his article, A Return to Which Self, Ali Shariati and Frantz Fanon on the Political Ethics of Insurrectionary Violence, from 2014. I couldn't have found older works by all of you, really. I'm sure you have more recent works, and maybe we can talk about that at the end, what you guys are currently working on. But I have to say, I'm very excited that you all are here, and I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. I've learned so much from your work over the years, and particularly these articles featured in this unit. Let's start with Fouzi, with your article on Fanon. I think it's such an important article for philosophers to read and to grapple with for a number of reasons. But one reason is because, and we see this happening currently, when philosophers are talking about the current situation in Palestine, this ongoing genocide, one tool that we have to talk about violence, political violence, is the writings of Frantz Fanon. And his work has always been popular in philosophy, at least in the last several decades. And we see his work being called upon to explain what's happening in Palestine today. I was listening to a popular leftist philosophy podcast the other day, What's Left of Philosophy, and I recommend that podcast. Anyone can go check it out. It's a popular podcast. But they discussed this genocide through the lens of Fanon's writings, and I couldn't help but think about your essay, Fouzi, because they managed to get through the whole episode without citing a single Arab author, let alone a Palestinian author. And that's not uncommon in this field. And I have to mention here, it really reaches its high point in Lewis Gordon's Zionist interpretation of Fanon's work. I don't know if you all saw this, but Lewis Gordon came out on social media a few months ago and just said, I've always interpreted Fanon as a Zionist. And Fanon was a Zionist and took a hard time for being a Zionist when he was in Algeria, and nobody knew what he was talking about. But Lewis Gordon is an incredibly influential philosopher, an incredibly influential interpreter of Fanon. In any case, Fouzi, your essay from 2008, and I'd add Mariam Khalah's essay in Unit 12. I really recommend her essay as well. They offer an essential diagnosis here of this notion that Fanon was the theoretical source of this anti-colonial violence in Algeria. And I'd like to just read a quote from your piece that I found particularly powerful. You write this, quote, "From the start of the book, in its very title, Fanon is clearly determined to talk about the wretched of the earth. His passion for their cause and his full engagement are both concrete and remarkable. By failing to name them as Muslims and their anti-colonial culture as Islamic, however, Fanon has no choice but to attribute that anti-colonial culture to tribalism and primitivism. He attributes their opposition to colonialism. He attributes their opposition to colonialism simply to a peasant, quote unquote, noble savage culture." And so, Fouzi, could you help us understand here, what exactly was the role of Islam in the Algerian Revolution? What was Fanon's relationship to that? And why is it so important that we don't downplay the role of Islam in the Algerian Revolution?
Well, you know, the more I looked into it, I found that, I mean, it's interesting that there's almost no mention of Islam in the wretched of the earth. But when you look further into it, you find that Fanon was really immersed in the culture of the Algerians. And he does describe many of their religious practices, many of the religious institutions. But he almost goes out of his way not to name them for what they are. And I think he does it for a number of reasons. First of all, that he, I think, was always saw Algeria as the experiment that could be applied widely on especially Africa and Latin America. And in a way, I mean, this is it's almost like Fanon always chose to use leftist, Marxist, Leninist language and terminology, because the audience he was talking to, he wasn't talking to the Algerian fighters, like, for example, Thomas Paine with Common Sense, which was like, the purpose was to energize the American, you know, fighters to fight the British. Fanon's book wasn't written for the Algerians. It was written for the European intelligentsia. And he knew their prejudices. He knew their hang-ups. He knew their, you know, double stances on issues. He knew their flip-floppings and, you know, and I think he carefully used the language that they understand, which is the language of leftist politics and Marxist Leninist revolution. But it seemed interesting that, you know, at the same time there is information that he changed his name to Ibrahim at some point. Mm-hmm. He was editor-in-chief of the newspaper of the Algerian Revolution, which was called Al Mujahid, right? And he was cognizant of the fact that what the Algerians were doing was a jihad to liberate the land. So the only explanation is that Fanon didn't see Islam as capable of articulating a modern political ideology. He saw it as a mobilizing force that the FLN was using to mobilize the masses. But there was, and we have to be fair, I mean, there was no Islamic terminology for him to use to describe whatever political project these people are trying to build, besides the fact that they just wanted the invaders out, right? So he's not going to talk about Khilafa or Khalifa or, going to dig into Islamic political history to try to find like the political terminology that these people would need to describe what future they're trying to build. So, I mean, revolutions like these, especially anti-colonial, they're not pre-planned. They appear like that. They happen like that. And whatever was available at that time was Marxist-Leninist, analyses. And at the level of the populations, the FLN mobilized the Algerians in the name of Islam and in the names of defending the Arabic language and Algeria as their homeland, and regaining their dignity, their basic dignity.
One thing I thought that was really interesting about your article was, this idea of spontaneity that Fanon talks about in The Wretched of the Earth.
Yes.
Really should be understood in terms of a long history of anti-colonial resistance in Algeria. That this was something that Algerians had gone through before with an invading occupier. And so, in a certain sense, what Fanon was seeing was a repetition of events, but they were new to him. Is that accurate? And could you from your article, could you walk us through some of those examples and some of those key figures from history? Because one thing I loved about your article, Fouzi, was it allows us as readers of Fanon to actually get beyond Fanon and read some of the Algerian history and some of the Algerian authors that might be presenting anti-colonial resistance in a different way than what Fanon, how Fanon presents it. I'm trying not to say in a more authentic way. I'm not trying to say that, but in a way that maybe hasn't been translated for a European audience, if that makes sense.
I think Fanon was in a real impasse in a way, because when you don't mention the Islamic dimension, all you're left with is, describing a society of quote unquote primitive society that's jumping on their invaders, like, as he described it, he says like stout men who need a push from the back. And the terminology he uses is almost reminds you of like Heart of Darkness, and the way Heart of Darkness describes the African natives. But that was the only choice he had, because classical Marxist theory rejects the idea that a peasantry can be a revolutionary class. So they're called the lumpen proletariat. Karl Marx called them sacks of potato. So he had to explain how could the lumpen proletariat become carrier of a revolutionary mission in a way. And the only way he could found was that this is a very traditional society that gets the intelligentsia comes from the city. So they're the urban Algerians who are educated in French schools and understand the meaning of sovereignty and, statehood. And, they go back to the village where they seek protection and educate these people in terms of, their historical mission to liberate their land. It is as someone who originally is from North Africa, I feel, it's a little insulting, to talk about these communities in these terms, but he didn't have another choice. But when he described these so-called backward primitive societies, the practices he described are well documented in history. France was in Algeria from the 1830s, and there has been many revolutions during that time in the 19th century. And the very first one was in 1832, 2 years into the French invasion. There was a massive rebellion by Amir Abdul Qadir, which lasted for about 20 years. He liberated almost the entire coastal part of Algeria and established a state that functioned for about 12 years, right? They didn't read Karl Marx and Freud, or they just mobilized people on the basis of demanding land and honor. And but back then, I think in the 19th century, our societies from the Atlantic to Asia still had the political terminology and political governance structures to put in place. So it was easy to just like eject the colonizer and go back to normal, right? This is the 1830 to 1840. Muslims were still freshly independent. They didn't. But when you go to 1960, the Algerians have been under French occupation for 130 years, right? France in Algeria destroyed completely all structures of education, politics, culture, the judiciary. There was nothing. There is the Algerian society, and there's these offices they used to call Bureau Arabe, which means the Arab office, right? So everything from law to politics to Hajj to birth and death and everything of Algerian society is sorted out in these Bureau Arabe. The Algerian, only 70% of Algerians were educated in French schools. So we're talking about when France got to Algeria in 1830, the rate of education, the rate of literacy was higher in Algeria than it was in France. Yeah. After 130 years of occupation, the rate of illiteracy among the Algerians was endemic, was at epidemic proportions. What Fanon did not notice is the work of this organization called the Organization of Muslim Scholars, which started its work from the beginning of the 20th century, and it was an extension of the work of Afghani and Abdu, right? Which is, one of these streaks of the Salafi movement, the Salafiyah, but this is a Salafiyah of Afghani and Abdu, which was much more progressive and, stressed the importance of learning foreign languages and adopting modern institutions and, rights and, progressive for women, and Muhammad Abdu visited Algeria, I think, in 1902, and the Organization of Muslim Scholars was established in 1903. By the 1950s, they had probably between 500 and 700 schools covering the entire Algerian territory. They were educating people in Arabic and Islam. That's it. So the French didn't see them as threatening. They were just called free schools, Madaris Hurra. They don't talk politics. They just educate the Algerians that Arabic is your language, French, Islam is your religion. And it's the formation of these 2 or 3 generations that it was, in a way, the cultural or intellectual revolution of the Algerian Revolution. That was the intellectual foundation, which in the 1960s provides a population that's already mobilized, conscious, articulate, educated. So they're not a lumpen proletariat as such. This is a society that has made inroads in literacy and in education. That's when the FLN comes in 1954 and declares the beginning of the Algeria War of Independence. But without the work of the Muslim scholars from 1904 to 1950, none of this would be possible.
And just to be clear, because you wrote a follow-up article to this, if I recall, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I remember you clarifying to the effect something to the effect of, look, it wasn't that I'm trying to say Fanon is the bad guy here, right? I think you do a really nice job in this article making clear that Fanon had certain circumstances. Yeah, I think that it comes through in the article.
Fanon is admirable. Yes, he's an admirable thinker and very bold.
Yeah.
The way he confronts his own racism is admirable, especially in the year 5 of the Algerian Revolution.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
playing how, you know, French liberals in Algeria completely understood Vietnam, for example, or, you know, Tunisia or some faraway place. But when it came to their own colonialism, they become like iffy and doubtful and don't understand the issue. And also we have to understand, I think this is where we come into philosophy. I think Fanon not only theorized violence, I think it diminishes from his importance when we only see that he theorized violence. I think he did an incredible intellectual effort to find a synthesis between progressive enlightenment and third world societies, and create a system of thought that is based on philosophy, on modern philosophy, on the Enlightenment, on Kant, on, you know, on Rousseau, but at the same time is trying to be, you know, you know, reform the Enlightenment and find common ground with Islam. He does find common ground with Muslims when he says that it took a Jew, he says, to make me realize the importance of the armed struggle. Right?
That's an incredible quote from Lansing. Yeah, that's such an incredible paragraph. I'd invite listeners to go check it out. Remind me where that was from again. I used to have this all memorized, and then I had a baby, and now I don't know anything anymore.
That's from the year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, which was a collection of his essays in Al-Mujahid, the articles he used to write in Al-Mujahid, which were unsigned. They were collected afterwards in this book called The Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. And in there, he explains the process from which, when he moves from being just a, you know, like a political liberal, he still can't understand why the Algerians are killing or using violence. And, you know, why don't they work with the Communist Party? And, you know, and he always felt that his French compatriots didn't find ground with the Muslims, people who were politically seeing themselves as Muslim reformers or anti-colonial activists. And he had to cross that barrier and go work with Muslim activists. And it's there understood. It's by getting over his, you know, the racism he acquired from, you know, just by being a product of Western epistemology, basically. Fanon is a product of Western epistemology to some extent. And that brings with it some baggage. That brings with it, I mean, even for us, when we look at our own societies, we tend to take an anthropological eye. And I think this is the situation that we have, is that Fanon's work has always been interpreted and monopolized by Western institutions and Western academic discussions who try to theorize from their own standpoints, you know, according to their priorities. We haven't had a serious discussion of Fanon's work like this, for example. This is brilliant because we have intellectuals from the South discussing the ideas of Fanon according to our priorities, according to our location in history. Sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Well, you just maybe to summarize it, the point that I love this footnote that you have on page 106, footnote 32. I'll read it for you. You're quoting a Fanon scholar, and you say, the fact that the study of Fanon's text continues to happen in the abstract with no real reference to the social, political, and religious context of Algeria at the time of the revolution is proof that the indigenous Algerian perspective still does not have a right of citation in what has become a decidedly Western debate. And I thought that that was such a beautiful sentence. It so describes my experience at philosophy conferences in the United States, in philosophy grad programs in the United States. And it, I think, does a great job of pointing out who it is you're criticizing in the article, because it is clear to me you're not so much criticizing Fanon as the way, as you are criticizing the way that we philosophers have not gone back and done the work to contextualize his writings. In a way, we've used his work to only further bury the Arab anti-colonial tradition. And I find that just an incredibly important point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I see Fanon as a complete philosopher that has a struggle to create a synthesis, a civilizational synthesis in a way, where he can see communities of the South, societies of the South join in modernity and join in the modern world on equal footing. And he doesn't see white people essentially as colonizers, but he sees white supremacy. He doesn't see the French themselves, but the French government. And also, I mean, when you combine, people don't pay attention to chapter 6, the pitfalls of national consciousness, which also describes in frightening details in 1961 what was going to happen in 1970s and 80s, and the failure of all those post-colonial governments, and how the bourgeoisie will fail in creating a national economy and just keep an independent country with the old colonial economy and just sit there to replace the settlers who leave. The way how universalist ideals of African unity, third world unity are quickly become sectarian. Quickly we start calling in Algeria, that immediately after the French left, they started talking about the foreign workers and the Sudanese and the Moroccans, and and all those calls for unity disappear, and we fall into a glorification of the state, the glorification of the struggle, and the silencing of any voices that have a different opinion in post independent societies. He was extremely frighteningly precise in describing them.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks, Fouzi. We could just maybe move on and talk about Arash Davari's article on Shariati. Fouzi, you were talking about, the way that Fanon is such an important, in a way, thinking through Enlightenment ideals in this anti-colonial context, trying to fuse together these two languages. Arash, in your article, I thought your article was such a great introduction for philosophers to the work of Ali Shariati, precisely because you pick up through this language that we philosophers would understand. I mean, your article really, you work in political theory, which I would say isn't far off from philosophy, and who knows what these fields amount to at the end of the day anyway. But I mean, you really did write a philosophical article for us that allows us, if we've read any Fanon, allows us to understand Shariati's writings. Could you just say a little bit about who Ali Shariati was? Since philosophers watching this may never have heard his name before, and may not have read his work. I just would say, I think, Fouzi, you mentioned in your article that Fanon, he wrote this letter to Shariati. He seemed aware of anti-colonial work being done by Muslim scholars, but he never cites them by name. And Arash, in your article, you start your article pointing out how Shariati scholarship hasn't done much to engage the writing of Fanon. And so I thought that was an interesting connection. So in any case, could you just say a little bit about who Shariati was, and then maybe we could get into the details of your analysis?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, so much for having me here. I'd like to actually start maybe with a bit of controversy and to spice what I have to say up a bit, and then I'll go through some of the more foundational questions that you asked. I don't believe there is a letter exchange between Fanon and Shariati. Shariati was prone to make things up, and as far as there's no evidence of an actual letter. The translation in the volume Alienation and Freedom is from Persian. If you look at the original French, it says Tadwi from Persian by his son, Ehsan Shariati. It's a direct translation of Shariati talking about a letter from Fanon, but there is no actual letter. I think, yes, and I think that's actually consistent with Shariati's method. And I think what's valuable in what Fouzi has said right now is he's brought our attention to Fanon's method. And I think for philosophers, for students, for people who want to engage these texts, we need to not stay with, let's say, chapter 1 on violence and say, this is what needs to be said about violence, but rather we need to look to these thinkers the way we would with a Hegel, a Rousseau, whoever, and think about how they think. And I think that there is an affinity between Fanon's discussion in the year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, where he talks about the radio and true lies, and Shariati's method, which also involves invention and fabrication in a strategic fashion, which he identifies with Islam and a kind of mystical relationship with Islam. So I'll start there. The letters, as far as the letters, as far as I'm concerned, do not exist. And that's the point, in fact. So Shariati was born in 1933, and he dies in 1977, 2 years before the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which, if you're in Iran, is called the Islamic Revolution. His ideas were highly influential for many of the activists who were involved, in particular, let's say, middle class, lower middle class university students who were eager to find ways to combine Western ideas that were radical, Marxism, existentialism, with traditions that they were more familiar with, Shia Islam in particular, Iran being the country that is most overwhelmingly Shia in terms of its Muslim population. Shariati had this incredible ability of combining existentialism, nationalism, third worldism, Marxism with Islam. And his background, for those who are interested, is he was in France from 1959 until 1964, where he studied on scholarship. He comes back to Iran, he's a professor, but his career really takes off as a public speaker and an orator. One might compare him to somebody like Malcolm X in terms of his capacity to be profound at the same time as being quite charismatic. If you listen to the audio of his speeches, even if you don't understand what he's saying, you can get a sense of that. He's a complicated figure. I don't think one can, and I make this point in the article, I don't think one can say that he was simply a revolutionary in a strict sense of the term, insofar as he wasn't simply encouraging insurrectionary violence. In fact, he had quite a bit of doubt, and he has a lot of mystical writings, his desert writings, where he's questioning and doubting himself. And in those writings, he thinks that before social change can occur, we actually need to transform ourselves. So there's an ethical component to those ideas that's in tension with the parts of his writings where he appeals to this story, which is foundational for Shia Muslims, the legend of Karbala, where he appeals to that legend in ways that quite obviously, I think, encourage insurrectionary violence. And the text that you've assigned speaks to that period in his writings. A point that I think has gone unnoticed is that Shariati invented a figure by the name of Chandel. Chandel was all kinds of things, depending on the context and the moment when he was speaking, but more often than not, a French intellectual. So there's this curious thing where you have an anti-colonial thinker, Shariati, citing a French intellectual while he's trying to break away from Western epistemology, and he's citing the French intellectual as an authority. Why is he doing this? Well, if you think about it, chandelle is a word in French which means candle, and Shariati's initials are Ali Shariati Mazinani, Ain, Shin, Mim. His pseudonym when he was writing articles as a youth before he went to Paris was Sham, which is an anagram, Shin, Mim, Ain, of his own initials. Sham in Persian means candle. So he goes to France and he comes back and he's translated his own pseudonym, his moniker that he used to write things that he didn't want to directly say. He's translated this into the French word for sham, candle, chandelle. Chandelle also, if you really want to get nerdy, is an aeronautical term for doing a 180 turn as a plane is taking off. But I'm not sure that Shariati was necessarily aware of that. In any case, what's interesting here is that he cites chandelle in his lectures, and often in the most controversial lectures. For instance, he has a lecture in 1969 called Ummat va Imamat, which people cite as justification to say that Shariati is the gateway drug into Khomeini and the worst aspects of the Islamic Republic. So it's cited as evidence that Shariati created grounds for an authoritarian post-colonial state, to recall Fouzi's discussion of the post-colonial state, that relied upon the authority of a figure like Khomeini citing the Imamate tradition in Shia Islam as grounds for exercising autocratic rule. I think that Shariati is far more complicated and mischievous than these accounts give him credit for. And his references to chandelle are evidence of this. So when he references chandelle, he's effectively inviting the audience to not trust him as a speaker and instead think for themselves, a highly Kantian kind of project. And so I think the same is happening with respect to the letter with Fanon. And I think that what he's effectively telling us, at least in my interpretation of his works, is that there is this thing there called Islam that has problematic manifestations, and he's quite clear in terms of drawing these Manichaean distinctions in his work, that has problematic manifestations, and that has another kind of manifestation that is imbued with one might call it a kind of mystical spirit. And I think that his methodology and his own thinking is performing that, and it's inviting his audience to also participate in it. So that's one answer, a very long-winded way of answering your question as to who Shariati is. If you want to ask that question, you have to ask, who is chandelle? And then we'll start to really get to talking. The other part of your question is, how has Shariati been interpreted? And I like the contrast that you drew, John, and maybe I can play off of that a little bit, which is that Shariati has been interpreted as being directly influenced by, one scholar calls it Nietzschean Heideggerian thought. The idea being that if one thinks in these terms, one is invariably heading towards fascism, and that the kind of ideas that Shariati espoused ended up leading towards Islamofascism in the Iranian context. That's the reading that you get from Iranian scholars who are primarily expatriates, disaffected by the post-revolutionary order, critics of it, and who, as a result, have not taken Shariati seriously. It's much akin to how Rousseau has been read. We think that Rousseau's ideas led directly to the terror after 1789 in France, when in fact, if we really want to read Rousseau and not just stop with book 1 or 2 of the Social Contract, we need to think about him outside of the historical events that transpired after he was thinking. So what I try to do in the article is I try to follow this line, which philosophers, political theorists have done with respect to a serious canonical figure like Rousseau. I try to follow that line with of thought or analysis with Shariati. And I do it, one of the moves that I make is to say that if we look at an essay Shariati wrote around 1968 called Bazgasht be Khish, A Return to Self, we see him directly situating his thinking in relation to post-colonial thought. So figures such as Aimé Césaire and Fanon. And if we do that, then we find something that is directly at odds with a Heideggerian, Nietzschean, Islamo-fascist kind of reading, because those kinds of readings say that a figure like Shariati was attempting to return to the past as a literal object, and that he was attempting to exalt that past identity and formation as something that needs to be recovered and imposed upon the present. This is the same kind of argument and misreading that happens with respect to Césaire, which Césaire, of course, responds to in Discourse on Colonialism. He says, no, when I talk about a return to the past, it's not a return to the literal past. In fact, and this is him drawing upon his interest in surrealism, it's a past that is in the present and of the future. Fanon does this as well when he ends Black Skin, White Masks with, oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions. The basis for thought is the body, which exists entirely of the past and towards the future. And I say that Shariati is doing the same kind of thing with respect to Islam. And the interesting question then to ask is, what is the understanding of colonialism that animates Black anti-colonial thinkers such as Césaire and Fanon? And then how does Shariati identify a difference, a similarity and a difference? He's working within the framework that they offer, but then he identifies a difference in terms of how he understands Islam, which we can't simply exalt and accept, without any questions asked, because obviously there's a very rich tradition of Black Islam as well. But these are the categories that he works with. And what's interesting, I think, is how these categories can be generative and what kinds of ideas they can foster. So maybe I'll stop there and see if there are other questions.
I have a million questions based on what you just said. That was so fascinating, honestly, like as a philosopher that really doesn't know very much about Ali Shariati. I mean, just in that introductory comment, you taught me so much more than what I already knew. Bashir, Fouzi, do you have any comments or questions at this point? I have some questions that would take us through the article, but if you all want to hop in and
I would like to thank him for confirming that the letter from Fanon to Shariati doesn't exist, because I could not. I could not get to the bottom of that. When I came across it, it was just reported. Yeah. And as such, but I always had suspicion about it. But he did try to, Shariati did translate The Wretched of the Earth.
No.
Oh, he didn't?
No. There's an article by Eskandar Sadeghi Burujerdi, and he interviewed at length Abul Hassan Bani Saad, which was one of the first presidents of the Islamic Republic after the revolution, who was an activist before the revolution. And Bani Saad very clearly says he actually translated it. And this is also in an oral history interview he did. Wow. That's in the Harvard Oral History Collection. He was the one who translated it, but because these student activists were underground, they put Shariati's name on the translation in order to have cover effectively. This doesn't mean that Shariati didn't read Fanon and read him carefully, but I don't think he didn't translate it, no.
Okay.
Wow, so my introduction was wrong, and we'll need to go back and fix some of the things that are written on the syllabus.
But it's also useful because this is what everybody says and repeats, and I think that it's good to have it out there and then correct it. And this is also my interpretation. I mean, I'm sure if you talk to the editors of Alienation and Freedom, they would disagree, or others might disagree, and that's fine. Go ahead.
How well documented is Shariati's stay in France and his involvement with North African students there? Because it was at the time of the Algerian Revolution, from 54 to, he was there from 59.
59 to 64. And for students and audience members who are interested, there's actually an excellent website created by Mariam Rabi'i, which is she was a student who studied with Ali Rahnama, who wrote an excellent political biography of Shariati, where he read everything that Shariati wrote, was in conversation with the family. And what this website does is it retraces all of Shariati's steps in Paris. And it identifies on a map all of the locations that he references, whether directly accurate or fictional. He made up all kinds of stories in his writings as well about figures in Paris, and we don't know if he was talking about himself or somebody else or what. But you can look at this website, and I can provide the link. I can find the link and share it with you, which gives you a comprehensive understanding of Shariati's time in Paris from 59 to 64, which did include a lot of engagement with North African students. Yes.
So Arash, could you help us here a little bit as philosophers? Could you say a little bit about this concept that comes up earlier on in the paper? You mentioned it, Bozgecht. Could you say a little bit about that? How might we translate that? And what's going on with that concept? Because as I was reading, it definitely seemed like a concept that is not being translated because it has a lot of different connotations. Could you help us just understand what that term means?
Sure. Yeah, the literal translation is return. And I think the easiest point of reference here for students who are familiar with Césaire and Fanon is the concept of return is complicated for those figures in a way that Shariati echoes. Now, I think perhaps I'll take this as an opportunity to talk about a distinction I make in the article between phenomenology and hermeneutics, at least in terms of how Shariati talks about return to self in that essay and his difference with a figure like Fanon. We get the following schema, which is that for Fanon, colonization primarily concerns Europeans' relationship with Blackness, which is to say that Europeans did not understand Black people, Black Africans, as having any intellectual, cultural production of merit or of value. Therefore, colonization of Black Africans involved their reduction to bodies. So there was no culture, art, history, ideas to return to. After that's the devastation, that's the tragedy of Western colonization in the Black African context. And Fanon, as a dialectical thinker, takes this moment of negation as an opportunity to create a universal humanity. So when he ends Black Skin, White Masks by saying, "Oh, my body, make of me always a man who questions," he's not only inverting a Cartesian imperative, but he's also specifically talking about the negation of the negation, which is, you've said that Black Africans are only bodies. Well, actually, being a body is precisely what locates you in the present and gives you this rich set of infinite possibilities in terms of how you look to the future. Shariati,
Okay,
yeah. For Shariati,
yeah, no, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
He says that Muslims do not experience colonization in that way. And again, I have a footnote in the article, and I want to be very clear that this is Shariati's interpretation, and it merits critique because he's separating Blackness from Islam. But Shariati says that Muslims do not have this experience of colonization because for Muslims, colonization was not a complete negation of their identity, but rather it involved what I have translated as disfiguration. The Persian word is mask shodan, which is the phrase used to translate Kafka's Metamorphosis into Persian, which happened around the same time when Shariati was writing. So we might translate it as transmutation or metamorphosis. at the end of the day, what disfiguration does is it's something akin to Edward Said, what Said later says in Orientalism, which is to say, you tell somebody, yes, you have a culture and a civilization, but it's less than. So it's not the complete negation of any kind of culture, ideas, intellectual work, but it's rather to recognize that it exists and then to say that it's less than, and to consistently say that it's less than Western epistemology and thought. This, according to Shariati, then begets a different kind of process of decolonization. It's not a matter of locating the present, the return to the body as this thing that is beyond ideas, and that being a rich source, a way to escape the traps that language leaves for us, which is the problem in chapter 1 of Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks. Instead, we have to engage with language, which is to say that for Shariati, decolonization is a narrative process. One needs to actually re-narrate Islamic identity such that one identifies its value and its merits, and that the process, the act of narration itself is an affirmation. This obviously accords with the discussion of Shahadat and the Karbala narrative, because the Karbala legend, because it's a story of a figure sacrificing himself, Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, and his sister Zainab bearing witness to the event and then reporting it, narrating it. And Shariati very much so identified with being a teacher. His father had clerical training, but chose to become a teacher. So in many ways, one could say, perhaps transgressing some gender norms here, that Shariati identified with Zainab, Hussein's sister. And he's calling upon that kind of practice as a continuous practice, one that is not simply going back to the temporal past, but one that involves storytelling and the interpretation of stories by an audience as what he means by return. And as we know from, let's say, Walter Benjamin's work and The Storyteller, the interpretation of a story is something that one does based off of their location in the present. One exercises judgment. I use Ricoeur's work on time and narrative in order to explain this in the article, but there's something far more open-ended about the refiguration of a story, Mimesis 3 in Ricoeur's work, that defies these interpretations of a return to self as being moving back to a static identity, a Muslim identity in the past.
So I should say I misspoke. You, in your article, you do translate the concept, but as return, but the text itself is not translated. Is that available for us as if we read English?
The text has not yet been translated. I am working with Mariam Rabi'i, who created that website I mentioned, and Siavash Safari, who's done an excellent book called Beyond Shariati about interpretations of Shariati's work by his children and other students of his in post-revolutionary Iran. Siavash and Mariam and I are compiling a kind of Shariati reader of texts that have not been translated into English, including that essay and a 1975 essay with the same title, which actually has those more literalist interpretations within it. So that will hopefully, it's under contract with University of Minnesota Press, and it will hopefully be available for students in, I don't know, 10 years, given academic publishing.
No, I know. Well, at least it's in the works, though. That's amazing.
It's in the works.
Yeah, that's Bashir or Fouzi, did you have any questions here?
Fouzi, would you
No,
like
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I have lots of questions, but I don't know how much time we have, and I guess, I mean, this should be like an open door to further conversations, I think, for both Fouzi and Arash, for me at least. I think that's just a wonderful idea to do this setup like that. But yeah, I mean, I have, okay, for now, I'm interested in the relationship of, I mean, this is something maybe very obvious for you, Arash, as a specialist on this, but so I'm just trying to understand, so what then is a more critical understanding of the relationship of Shariati with what becomes the Islamic revolution, what becomes that that side of the revolution that takes over further on, Khomeini coming back and all that. Is there any link between Shariati and that project, if it is a project at all? Because I guess it's not really, it becomes a project as it goes along, right? No, if I understand correctly, it's something that happened on the spot. And but yeah, I guess this is a big question. I don't know if we have...
It's a great question. I think that there is a rich intellectual tradition of people interpreting Shariati in different ways, some of whom get involved in governance in post-revolutionary Iran and become part of what is known as the reform movement, many of whom are critics of the state apparatus, but critics within a shared framework and within a shared kind of epistemology. And so I would perhaps defer to Siavash Safari's book, Beyond Shariati, which is specifically, precisely looking for the afterlives of Shariati's work. And maybe I can share with you an anecdote that was shared with me when I was doing interviews for my dissertation, which is I interviewed a Trotskyist who was in prison. And as you all know, there were many people, dissidents who were revolutionaries who were in prison during the 1980s. And she was in prison, and around 1984, as she recalls it, she was in an education session. They would hold these education sessions in the prison, and there was a cleric sitting at the front of the room and lecturing and inviting students to ask the prisoners to ask questions, so that it was a corrective kind of process. And one person raised his hand, she says, and they would give them the official newspapers to be able to read. And in that day's official newspaper, or that week's official newspaper, there was a spread on Shariati, celebrating Shariati. And this individual raises his hand and he says, you have this spread in the newspaper celebrating Shariati, and as far as I understand, I'm in prison because I was a follower of Shariati. So what gives? Why am I here? And the cleric says that Shariati is a stone in the middle of the river, and you're supposed to step on that stone in order to go to the other side, but there's trouble if you stay on the stone. And so I think this is very telling. I think Shariati
is quite... And that's how many of us got stuck on the stone.
Many of us. I think it's very precise, in fact. I think the revolutionary mobilization is the stone, and your ability to stay in a state of becoming, if you will. And I think there's elements here where we can talk about, Shahadat and Shariati's discussion of Islam as a middle doctrine, maktab-e wasiteh, and what it means to be in the middle and to maintain a middle position with respect to politics. But I'll leave it at that, maybe.
Okay, no, thanks for this. Actually, I'm going to check that book. I think I heard that title, Beyond Shariati. I've come across that title, because obviously Shariati is a big figure in what I would call the Hala Islamiyya, it is in the Shia version localized in Lebanon. And what's interesting about this is that there's so many, it's such a complex framework, obviously, again, for a Western reader, maybe that's, John, that would be interesting for the class, is that we all see the Islamic world as a monolithic thing. And actually you can see how just one figure is claimed by a lot of people, and probably he himself didn't even think he would identify to any of them. And then, same with Fanon, and how he tried to position himself. And Fouzi was talking about this. This is so interesting, how these intellectuals keep their own idiosyncrasies, and but at the same time are instrumental to these movements too, in one way or another, for good or bad, or for, so yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting point.
Arash, for philosophers who wanted to read more Shariati, obviously we're going to look for your anthology coming out. Could you maybe help us out? I mean, obviously this will be your interpretation, your perspective, but where should we start? I mean, how did we do? Like, for instance, how did we do? You know, grasping in the dark and finding this discussion of Shahid. I mean, it might not be the place to start. Is there a kind of path that we should follow, or a text that you'd recommend for us as philosophers as we wanted to learn more?
Yeah, I think the problem is challenging because the state of translations into English is not good. It's very ideologically charged. Whereas if we were talking about translations into Turkish or Arabic or even French, there's a lot more to work with. That said, I think there's a translator by the name of Lale Bakhtiar who passed away a few years ago. And some of the works she has translated and chosen to translate, I think, give more insight into the interpretations that I'm trying to offer here. So I would recommend Religion Against Religion. It's a short book, short essay rather. It's published as a small book. And there's another one called Fatima is Fatima. That might be an interesting one to, it's a different angle, right? This thread that is in Laura Deeb's article, the stuff on narrative that's in Bashir's article. I think, you know, if you want to think about it through the figure of Zainab, I think that that text by Lale Bakhtiar, translated by Lale Bakhtiar, might be a useful point of reference. And then there's, you know, the Algar translations are interesting. Instead of Marxism and other Western fallacies, and there's a lot of controversy around that text and its framing. There's an article by Asif Bayat which criticizes it. You might want to look at, I believe it's on the sociology of Islam, and it's selections translated from a 3-volume set called Islam Shanasi. So it's very selective, but there's some stuff on there. There's some essays in there on humanism that might be interesting as an entryway for philosophy students. With Siavai Safari, I published an article on translation and Shariati, and we review the state of the field in terms of English translation. So I can share that with you if you'd like, as a reference.
I think that's on your academia page. I've not read it. I've not read it, but we can find that on your academia.edu website. Okay, that's great. That's really helpful. That's really helpful, Arash. For the sake of time, if we could move on and talk about Bashir's work, which will bring us to South Lebanon. Bashir, your work on Hezbollah has been really enlightening to me. You wrote a book. Oh, whoa, I'm so bad with these dates now. 2018, is it a 2018 book? Hezbollah and the Politics.
The book 2016, and actually the article 1 year before 2015.
Okay, sorry. Hezbollah and the Politics of Remembrance. And this article anticipates some themes that are in that book. You sent us another article today, which I think I'll add to the syllabus. I love both these articles.
Just
but
sorry,
go ahead, Bashir.
As I was reading the works of Fouzi and Arash, I thought the other article would be just blend itself more with. I mean, I can talk about it after if you want, but go ahead.
Let's maybe we could talk about both articles. So the 2015 article it goes into these themes of time, memory, death, and resistance to colonialism. And you focus on how Hezbollah's writing practices comprise a kind of ethics through martyrs' acts of witnessing and testifying to certain ways of life. And now in the Fanon text for this unit, Fanon writes this. He writes, quote, violence in everyday behavior, violence against the past that is emptied of all substance, violence against the future, for the colonial regime presents itself as necessarily eternal. And one thing that's interesting about that line from Fanon in the speech, Why We Use Violence, is that he's talking about colonialism, not just about an occupation of land, but there's also an occupation of time. And this theme of temporality that we saw in Arash's article, I think, is really comes through here in some of your work, Bashir. And so, Bashir, you write in your article, quote, key to understanding the Islamic Revolution's fight against Israeli occupation is its attempt to control time dimension. The ideological translation of the act of resistance is a promise that enables traceable ethical lines of conduct in time and that is reiterated in traceable form. I found that to be just an incredibly interesting passage. It's a theme that you go into much more detail with in your book. But what exactly are these new conceptions of time that are introduced through the martyr? And I thought, Bashir, the reason why I thought this article was relevant was Arash's work has a lot to say about temporality. And I think this idea of a martyrology and a decolonization of time is incredibly philosophically interesting to me. So could you say a little bit about that?
Well, thanks first, really, John, for your interest in our works. I think, you know, this is always a pleasure to hear that people read this stuff in that particular manner, and you're bringing me back to something I've written a while ago, and much has happened since then. But yet, you know, every time I see Hezbollah's, let's call it cultural production in general, I am reminded that, you know, this stuff is there. It's still there, and I can talk about this a bit. I just want to say that just as a summary, so that the conversation is not really long, but I think my main focus was, my main interest was to understand if there was a difference, or if there's some kind of a qualitative difference between something we would call secular, or at least, you know, secular here as in borrowed from the West in the first place, but then maybe, you know, nativized in one way or another. I don't know how. And is there a break between this and something then that rises? That, I mean, the way the narrative works is that you have this, and then on the other hand, at some point, there's some kind of Islamic manifestation of phenomena that appears, and it has often been put in as binaries, you know, that one is such and the other is just a different beast. Of course, the actors in place do portray it as such. I mean, there's kind of at least in the 80s and the 70s, there was a irreconcilable rift between these things, at least seemingly so, and there was conflict over that. And I don't know much about the Iranian uprisings and the revolution. Probably Arash would say more, but I would suspect that there was that kind of binary was at play. And then on the street, of course, and on the street, it was much more complex than that. And the you know, I mean, just now he was just talking about Shariati shows that binary is not exactly what it seems to be. And for me, Hezbollah was something similar. I was trying to understand to what extent there is a difference between Hezbollah, say, and other groups, but also at the same time, to what extent it emerges in an ecosystem that is a blending, as a melting pot of stuff. And the other article on Ashura has a lot on this, because I look a lot on how the communists also have, basically communist parties. I don't know if how it works in other parts. I know in Iraq and in Lebanon, the Communist Party was one of the first who actually organized Ashura rallies. They actually were those who instrumentalized Ashura as a place to do class-based consciousness, or kind of class-based kind of discussions. And there was not much of a big deal about being a communist and being a believer, Whereas, obviously with the classical Marxist lens, there was a bit of a, condemnation of religion. Religion is the opium of the people, all that stuff that Marx said. Of course, there was a bit of that also. That exists in the Arab world too. And there's definitely a dichotomy between, if we want to be progressive, we need to be communist and let go of religion, things like that. And that because that's how Marx talked about it, this is how the Soviet Union is, and other places and whatever. So you have that, but you also have all sorts of people and some other forms of communism where for some people it was a case-by-case basis. Some people really delved into, a particular understanding of tradition, whatever that means, of a legacy lineage. And there was definitely, there's a huge heritage of, the Prophet's family, it's such a politically rich history. Just what we call the Sira, the Nabawiyya, but also Ahl al-Bayt, and then the other, the various empires that happened. So, okay, when we approach this from a secular historical situation, that becomes that becomes the thing of history books that you read, and just like the Protestants did in the West or other places. But what was interesting about Hezbollah, just to come back to what we were talking about, and I did wanted to make it brief, is that with Hezbollah, you have really a synthesis of all this together, I find, in a highly organized, of course, systematic way that involves institutions and all that, and the martyrology, for example, practice that obviously happened in Iran also, and I mean, Hezbollah learned from Iranians, especially the Iraq-Iran war, but they did it in their own way also. It's quite, they've Lebanonized it, as I would say, even though it's not really a thing. But yeah, so what I was trying to find out is to what extent Hezbollah involves some kind of historical consciousness, and this is the theme of time, because obviously that's another it's a Marxist theme, that you have, once you are aware of what's going on, you understand who's being exploited, who's not, where is inequality, where is injustice. This is at the core of the Shia discourse, or at least the modern Shia discourse. I mean, it's always been there, but of course, in modernity, it gains this kind of, slightly, I mean, it mirrors the kind of questions you have in the modern capitalist economy, and the modern nation state, and all that, and that comes from the leftist heritage. I mean, it's obvious. It's the discourse of the mustad'afin, or the mustad'afin in Persian, is just plastered all around the intellectual production of that party. And the way it goes is, my point was to say that instead of looking at it in discourse, it actually is there in action. So the martyrology itself, the action itself, is the philosophical thinking, is the creation of ideology, is the creation of, and why? Because yes, it breaks up the calendar into events that we come back to until today. So today, Hezbollah, every any week, there's the assassination of this person. There's this Shahid, the Yom Shahid, the Yom, I don't know. It continues until that very day, and it breaks up the whole spectrum of the calendar. Now, this is done by nationalist movements, secular nationalist movements. That has been done in France, Germany, wherever, you know, also. But the way Hezbollah does it, and this is where I find it interesting, is that it links it to an Islamic time also. It breaks the boundary of this is just a nation. No, it goes back to the prophetic time. It goes back to, you know, all of that. And so the idea of point of origin is different there. And there's, you know, there's a God-centered universe here, and there's a, you know, there's a continuity. And I invite, I mean, if you hear now Nasrallah, he's speaking now. He's giving his Ashura speeches in the next few days. He started yesterday. It's very rich in that discourse, especially the Ashura speeches, which is why I actually then decided to write an article just on the Ashura speeches, because his Ashura speeches are just different, and I think they're a condensation of decades of intellectual Shia and other production that happens from Iran to Iraq to, you know, there's many figures, and probably Shariati are one of them, used in one way or another. So yeah. So that was one of the. I don't know if I answer what you're saying, and I kind of described a little bit.
Yeah. No, it's very helpful. Did anybody else have any have a comment here or a question? Yeah, go ahead.
Two maybe quick ones. One out of curiosity, I was wondering when the communists started to use Ashura as an opportunity to organize and mobilize. And then the second one is, it just occurred to me that, you know, Mustazafin is, I suppose, a way of translating le damné, the wretched. And I wonder if there's maybe a conversation to be had about this category, the subject of history, as opposed to it being the proletariat, is for Fanon le damné. And it's in these contexts, Lebanon and Iran, Mustazafin. And is there something qualitatively different when the subject of history is not the proletariat, but le damné and Mustazafin?
Yeah, and I think maybe Fouzi may be interested in this question. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, just to remind the readers or the people who will be watching this, as mustadafin is a Quranic term. There's a verse in the Quran that says that God, Allah will make the oppressed, if I can translate this as such, or le damné, or the damned, or al-mustadafin. So the ones who are, I think that the best translation, I don't know, correct me, Fouzi, or, you know, if you speak, I don't know if you speak Arabic, Arash, but for me, mustadafin is the one who's being crushed by power of some sort, that is made weak, the weak, that is weakened by, you know. So it says that God will make the weak, the oppressed, or be vanquished. They will vanquish in the end. They will rise up. And yeah, it's one of the verse that is the most quoted in the beginning, and especially in conversations with leftists, saying that you know, we also have a discourse of oppressor and oppressed as, you know, believers, Islamic Muslim believers. And I'm pretty sure it must have been there in Algeria or in the early elaborations, even probably from I think I've seen it also. Is this the Libyan? There was a Libyan. What was the name? I don't know, Fouzi, if you know. There's a name of the Libyan leader who fought the
Mar Mukhtar.
Mar Mukhtar, exactly. I think he has a whole discussion of mustadafin. He talks about this. It's kind of a.
It simply means the oppressed on earth. Mustadaf, it's from da'af, is weakness.
Yeah.
Da'if, weak person. and mustadaf is someone made weak or oppressed.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I think the translation of Fanon into Farsi was al-mustadafin fil ard, which was also the name of the movement of Imam Musa Sadr that he started in Lebanon.
Yeah, exactly.
Mustadafin fil.
We also have
That-
Muqtada Sadr and Bakr al-Sadr, actually, not Muqtada Sadr, it's another guy. Bakr al-Sadr in Iraq, who was one of the teachers of Nasrallah and Abbas al-Musawi, people who become the founders of Hezbollah. Yeah, so all of these people are connected, I would imagine.
Can I just point to this connection between the left and Islam and the way how out of how the communists started the Ashura celebration in Lebanon, and how Shariati himself and his followers came from, communist socialist backgrounds, and it was the followers of Mossadegh basically who just transformed, and they didn't even need to grow beards; they had beards. And the same thing in Lebanon for the followers for Hezbollah and Amal followers, they were former communists. And we see the same, I don't know how you call it, synthesis or dichotomy between Islam and the left, I mean, you have Frantz Fanon from like the tradition of the radical left, and the official doctrine of the FLN in Algeria was socialism and communism. But again, there is a struggle there. As soon as they got their independence, and Jean-Paul Sartre and those French intellectuals came to Algeria and asked for their rum and their whiskey, and the Algerians said, no, sorry, we're an Islamic country. So there was like a marriage of interest. At some point, the radical left and Islam found a convenience to, join forces. The leaders of the Algerian revolution were mobilizing people in the name of jihad, but to the European intelligentsia, they were speaking a language of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, and here we come into manipulation, political convenience, we go into ideology here. It's not, I mean, Hezbollah's relationship with oppression has, had its up and downs. Sometimes it has been in the past clearly a champion of oppressed communities and stuff, but at many occasions, including like in Syria, for example, it was the colonizer, it was the oppressor, and it was not an agent of liberation anymore, but an agent of status quo, of oppression, of displacement, even the way how many Syrian villages have been completely depopulated of their Syrian population and populated anew with either Lebanese or Iraqis or Afghanis or whatever. So this connection, this relationship between the left and Islam continues until today. You look at the progressive movement in the United States, we still have a coalition between CARE and other Islamic organizations in the US and the radical left or the left. You have the famous study by what's his name, the French Orientalist who wrote Islamic.
Maxime Rodinson.
Can you remember it?
Maxime Rodinson.
Maxime Rodinson, exactly. And this is why Fanon and Shariati found no problem in blending radical liberation philosophy with Islam, because Islam has a progressive radical liberation side, just like it has other sides. We shouldn't just, have glorify in the unconditional. Islam also has its, slavery side and oppression and occupation and, gender issues and, but at the same time, they saw these two sides of Islam and radical left ideology as compatible, and it's still compatible today. Sometimes they're fighting, sometimes they're in an alliance, sometimes, the relationship between the Assad regime and Hezbollah. There you go. Hezbollah was it, you talk about Ashura and the Ashura celebration. Do you know that the Ashura celebration were adopted from European opera, spectacles of the European opera in the 17th century also, and were recreated as theatrical performances by the Safavid government in the 17th century, 18th century.
Yeah, I mean, they were influenced by the way theater works in Europe, but they haven't been, there's a whole literature. I mean, yeah, there's a whole discussion about this, but I think it's not that it was invented by that theater. There was definitely a tradition of mourning that existed, but definitely the theatrical element comes from European. You are right. But I just want to say something about this whole left Islam relationship. I think what's interesting is that at some point when there's tension, then the differentiation is more salient. So the protagonist wants to differentiate. Like you said, for example, in the case of Algeria, in the case of Hezbollah, something like this happened because when Hezbollah emerges, you have a lot of leftist groups around, and you have a lot of groups. So the early writings in the Hezbollah related cultural sphere is stressing how different they are because they're believers, and that if you're a believer, you have obviously a line of conduct, and you have an ethical. That's the question of ethics that separates you, and that in their mind, of course, in the way they're explaining it, that the leftist who doesn't have that will be astray, or will be always led astray, or something like this. But to answer the question of Arash, I forgot to answer you. I think it's in the 50s, the earliest Ashura. There's a really good book on this. It's called Clerics and Communists, by Rula Jurdi Abi Saab and her husband Malik Jurdi Abi Saab. I think Malik Saab. They wrote a wonderful book on Iraqi and Lebanese Shia politics, but it's about communists basically. Yeah, how communists really, especially in Iraq, communists were really strong. I mean, Iraq was communist for a few years, and it's one of the only, I mean, with Yemen, the few countries in the Arab world that actually had a communist, regime. Very, very short-lived, but so they were really strong. So, and the other thing I wanted to say, yeah, no, actually, that's it. So there's this book, but I think, yeah, there is a difference. I think the point is to say that, at least from the Islamically inclined, the intellectual discussion, the difference is that, the Islamic turn presents a more counter-hegemonic discourse than the other. Whether it's true or false is a different question. It's just how it was presented and the kind of role it plays. And I think it's still contested today. I mean, yes, Hezbollah's controversial intervention in Syria that Fouzi was talking about was condemned by a lot of people, but also I feel it didn't actually. It doesn't mean that Hezbollah is now part of a hegemonic, if you want. They're still, in a sense, I feel, I wouldn't say they're oppressed or oppressors. Of course, there's much better off than how they were in the 80s, but they're still, in the way they behave and the way they discuss, the way the kind of forces they face globally, and the way things work. I feel that they're still part of that kind of counter-hegemonic, or at least they're struggling to justify some kind of counter-hegemonic discourse for good and bad reasons. Of course, that's a different questions.
But Bashir, could I ask a question, maybe just to wrap us all up, along the lines here of what we've been talking about, particularly this relationship between Marxist traditions and Islamic traditions. I've been reading Ali Kadri's book, The Accumulation of Waste. I can't recommend it enough. We have a unit on imperialism. The last unit of this syllabus is on imperialism. Kadri says, if I can summarize it, Kadri says in that book, he says his argument is that the only form of imperialism is US-led capital. So there's American imperialism, and that's it. American imperialism, and when we talk about imperialism for our student audience, broadly speaking, we're talking about a transfer of wealth, transfer of resources from the global south to the global north, or the imperial core, understood as Europe or the United States, particularly the United States. And so imperialism, the imperial class, the billionaire class, makes its money not just by stealing resources from the global south, not just by forcing the global south to work for what are in effect slave wages, but Kadri also says that the excess population in the global south is so great at this point. What you might call the reserve army of labor is so massive at this point that the real way that the imperial class is making money is by killing Arabs. So like Northrop Grumman or Elbit Systems, the product that they produce, the commodity, is in fact a dead Arab or a dead African. And his understanding of imperialism today is as he puts it, it is laborers working with other laborers to kill laborers. And the commodity, the product, is today a dead Palestinian, a dead Iraqi, a dead Libyan, etc. This is the ultimate product of capital today, the most profitable product. And so when you talk about for instance, the military-industrial complex and how much money there is in that, where does the money come from? Well, they're in effect selling this product. That's Kadri's point. And so Bashir, from the standpoint of capital, the dead Arab, the dead Lebanese, the dead Palestinian is the commodity. What I find so interesting about your work, and you see it in Arash's work as well, in this Shariati piece that we recommended, is that in the Islamic tradition, that the brutality, the barbarism, the viciousness of imperial capital gets retranslated, and the martyr becomes something else. Certainly not merely a commodity, but something liberatory. So could you maybe just say a little bit about how, I know this is kind of a basic question for everybody, but just to wrap up for everyone, how it is that that death in this tradition becomes something more than just, as we often hear in the United States, the elimination of a terrorist threat or a protection of a American way of life. It actually becomes a kind of anti-colonial ethical model for the martyr.
There's one thing is that in the early 80s, what really shocked the Americans and the Western world is that, you know, people were willing to die so easily to do, you know, like, for example, suicide attacks and all that, even though there were suicide attacks before, there were non-Islamic suicide attacks, let's call them this way. Actually, some guy did a study on this and showed that actually suicide attacks overwhelmingly in the 20th century, the Islamic component of people who conduct suicide attacks is the lowest percentage of suicide attacks, which is interesting. I found, I don't know if you know about this. It's a book by a guy called Robert Papp or something. I can send you. It's called Dying to Win.
Yeah,
you know,
Chicago.
yeah, I think it was a really well argued discussion. But anyway, that shows that, yeah, I mean, suicide attacks wasn't specifically an Islamic thing, and far from it. But I think, yeah, this facility to martyr yourself was a, and it was interpreted in many ways. I mean, the cynical way was, oh, these people are manipulated to go and kill themselves. You know, there's an instrumentalization of religion. You know, and that discourse is maybe valid. I mean, you know, some people, you know, that all of these discourses are valid. There is you can think about it through the cynical lens, but there's also, I mean, you can see that. I mean, if you read it through the Kantian lens, or the you know, the lens of you become what you want to become. You know, there's so much of this in the martyr discussion. There's, you know, these testaments that they film, and which I think they took from the Iranians also, and then really blew it out of proportion and did a whole industry out of this. But there's these testaments. You can have a look. There's some of the stuff these martyrs say, because we see the testament once the person has died in battle, or else you don't know the identity of the person. And I've been listening. I mean, my last, you know, the last year or so, I've been interested in just getting a hang of these testaments, and there's like countless testaments, and some of them are really interesting. It's not, you can hear someone really grappling with the human condition and what it is to be human. What am I doing? Why and how? You know, and taking the decision to do whatever they're doing, and how they're facing what is the enemy, and what is an enemy for them, and why is it worth it to go and die for that. And so it kind of opens the door to this discussion of yeah, I mean, martyrdom and dying for a cause, or is not something. It's part of life, you know. It's kind of it's yeah, it's kind of inscribed in a way of living. You know, by dying you are living in a sense.
There's that quote from your work. I'll mess it up, but the quote from your work is something along the lines of, "We practice dying. We practice dying every day," they say. I find that incredibly interesting.
There's a quote from the son of Imam Hussein. So you have, Hussein is the son of Ali, Imam Ali, or, you know, Ali bin Abi Talib, who is the husband and also the cousin of Fatima Zahra, who is the daughter of the Prophet. So you have that lineage, right? And the Ahl al-Bayt, and then you have the son of Ali. The Hussein is called Ali also. Imam Ali is called Zain al-Abidin, or Imam Sajjad. He wasn't in Karbala, so when Imam Hussein died. But so there's a lot of quotes of him about the oppressor, or this in discussion with governors of the Umayyad realm, and they're very much taken and developed in many ways by Hezbollah and others. And one of them is he's being threatened by the governor that follows the Umayyad regime. And he says, "Are you threatening me? Are you threatening me with death?" And then he says, "Death for us is a habit. In al-qatl lana 'ada." And I find this, it's so ingrained now in Lebanese consciousness, because Hezbollah repeats it all the time, you know, in their speeches and stuff. And I think, you know, there's something really strange about this word habit. You know, it's not al-'ada means, it's like habituation. We inhabit death. For us, it's you know, it's part of living, basically. You're not dead because I'm talking to you, you know, right? So you're living, but in a way, I live death. You know, so it's a kind of a consciousness of some kind of other realm that you're always in. And of course, I'm not saying Hezbollah is the only ones who have that, but I'm saying at least in their case, it's very explicit in that discourse of it's so much taken to a daily, remembering of it through the all the other stuff. So
well, I think that's a place where we could wrap this conversation up. Thanks so much, everybody. I learned so much from you. I really do. I learned so much in this conversation, and it's a great look at what philosophy is, and really what our field could be when we engage thinkers like you all. It's such a great education that you all are providing. So thanks so much.
Thanks, John.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
All right. With that, we can wrap this recording up.